Because the number one thing that came out of this whole period is that there were absolutely no consequences for any of the people who committed this wide-scale fraud. We had these massive bailouts, and there's an enormous amount of public anger about that. If you couple the bailouts with the lack of law enforcement and the lack of prosecutions, there's really no incentive going forward for people on Wall Street not to commit crimes. Especially if they're incredibly profitable. If people on Wall Street look at that and they say, hey, if I rip off, a pension fund or an insurance company or a foreign bank or a foreign hedge fund, there will be absolutely no consequences.
So basically the only lesson they've learned is that they can do anything and get away with anything, and that's just
right.
The bottom line.
And even if it all blows up, even if we bet completely wrong, the worst case scenario is that the government is going to come in and bail us out with taxpayer money.
A little further, if you could literally describe the relationship between Wall Street and Washington in one sentence, really, what would that?
It's completely commingled. It's a revolving door of interests where people on Wall Street are either directly sponsoring the politicians in Washington with campaign contributions and soft money and that sort of thing, or else they are actually politicians.
Who or what can really change that? Who has the power to do it? Who has the force to do it? And who would be interested in changing that whole
Well, voters
way of life?
Obviously have the ability to make those changes. They have the ability to not choose politicians who are beholden to Wall Street, theoretically. But the problem is Wall Street heavily sponsors both the Republican and the Democratic parties. So automatically, no matter who becomes the front-running candidate for the presidency, is going to be a creature of Wall Street. Look at Barack Obama, who I personally admired during his campaign of 2008. But if you look at his record, Goldman Sachs was his #1 private campaign contributor.
What about third parties? Is that even an option, or is that never going to happen in this country?
Seriously, I don't see it. I don't see it becoming having a major impact. I think you might see the occasional politician who's really not part of that world make a run.
Why is that, though? If people are obviously understanding at this point that Democrats and Republicans are different sides of the same coin, why not
really
opt
understand that, though?
They don't?
No,
you really
I don't think so.
Still?
I think your average American doesn't see that. And I think ordinary people are very seduced and mesmerized by this phony media-created division between blue and red and left and right and Democrats and Republicans, and people are conditioned to believe that there are enormous, profound differences between these two parties, whereas the reality is their differences are mostly superficial, and on the important questions of how the economy is run and how to regulate the economy, they're exactly the same. But I don't think ordinary people know that.
What about the relationship between the media and Washington, D.C.? Like you say, they represent either one or the other, really, these days, the mainstream media. Where does that take us? What kind of a really situation does that create in the U.S.? And who is supposed to kind of revamp the media at this point?
People who have this image of American news media as being some kind of top-down, corrupted entity that is pumping out propaganda. That's not really the way it works. It's really a sort of nihilistic, purely for-profit entity that is just out to make money. And in the process of doing that, they have absolutely no interest whatsoever in doing social interest reporting. They will just do whatever it is that's going to attract the most advertising. And so as far as politics goes, that means playing up this whole reality show narrative of left versus right, and so that's our problem. These are for-profit companies, and there's no money in doing the right thing. So that's how we get the media we have.
So what kind of situation does that create? If what you're saying, we have Washington out to please Wall Street out to make profit, news corporations and the mainstream media out to make profit. Who is out there to do something to maybe do something for the American people, for example? They need the help right now.
There are a lot of good people in government. There are a lot of good people in media. The problem is systemically, they're never going to be able to take hold because the forces at work are are powerful and they're entrenched, and they're also very efficient. I mean, these media companies, they do make a lot of money, and so it's going to take an awful lot to move them off their commercial model, and I just don't see that happening.
So real change is not coming anytime soon?
I mean, I don't see it. I mean, I think you could have incremental change, and I think, you know, if there is a big enough crisis, you might even see significant changes, but for the most part, the way it's set up, it's just really an uphill climb for ordinary people to get their issues in front of the right politicians and get real change made.
Do you think the crisis of '08 wasn't big enough? Is that just the beginning? Should we kind of expect something worse to happen?
Well, you would have thought that that would have been big enough. I mean, you would have expected a crisis of that magnitude would have motivated the government to make significant changes, but they really didn't. I guess it will have to be something worse before they you know, to make those real changes.
If we switch gears a little bit and talk about, you know, go from the people who are pocketing all this money to the way the money is being thrown around the globe. First of all, militarily, of course, because that's a serious issue with the wars ongoing in the U.S., I mean, that the U.S. is participating in. We've touched upon this a little bit. Why isn't this money being put into creating factories, opening up, you know, manufacturing jobs, really picking up the middle class back up from its knees?
That's just not the way that the American political mainstream thinks. I mean, if you look at the what happened when Obama passed his $700 billion stimulus, that was ostensibly to create jobs. I mean, it was a government program to help put people back to work. There was an enormous, you know, coast-to-coast outrage at the idea that the government has any business trying to help people put people back to work. On the other hand, when we spend 10 or 15 times that amount bailing out Wall Street after 2008, there was nothing like the same kind of outcry. Or when we spend a comparable amount fighting pointless and idiotic and bloody wars of conquest in faraway places, when we spend enormous sums of money on endeavors like that, again, there isn't the same kind of outrage. You
call the wars idiotic. Why do you think the politicians fail to see that? What is really, do you think, the underlying purpose of Libya, for example, for you?
Libya, I don't know. I mean, I think that this wasn't a situation like Iraq where the United States had a clear long-term plan to go into this country and went in there with their eyes wide open. And if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, to me, those are more indicative of what we look for or what they're thinking about in terms of foreign policy. They have these long military stalemates, deployments that are going to go on forever and ever and ever, and that are going to cost $100–200 billion a year. And they're the official policy of the United States is to keep these things going and to have a presence in that region. I think it's political inertia at this point. If you look at Afghanistan, for instance, clearly I think the main reason that we're there is because the Democratic Party views Afghanistan as our war. It's their way of going into an election season and being able to say that, you know, we're just as tough as the Republicans. It's not that we're against war per se, we just didn't like the Iraq war, so look, here we are in Afghanistan, we're tough. That's really the only reason we're there, so that, you know, Barack Obama doesn't have to take criticism that he's weak and limp-wristed.
All right, Matt Taibbi, thank you very much for your time with us.
Thank you.